The story of Franklin Delano Floyd and Suzanne Marie Savickas. This is the leading image on Franklin Delano Floyd. In actuality, the little girl is Floyd's stepdaughter, Suzanne Marie Savickas, who he'd kidnapped around 1974, when Suzanne was under 10 years old. He would go on to raise her as his daughter, putting her through high school under several pseudonyms, have a son with her in 1988, and marry her in 1989 under the name Tonya Hughes. By 1990, Suzanne had decided to leave Floyd and take her son, Michael, with her. In April of that year, she was found beaten and bruised on the side of a highway, and she subsequently died in the hospital. Michael went into foster care and was adopted, only to be kidnapped by Floyd in 1994 and to never be seen again. The story of the prayer of Apollo 1 astronauts. Although this photo was taken as a light-hearted gag, the image of the Apollo 1 crew, jokingly praying over a miniature of their command module, turned deadly serious in retrospect. The three men, Roger Chaffee, Virgil Grissom, and Ed White, would burn to death during a test launch on January 27, 1967. Tragically, the three men had even voiced concerns about the craft's amount of flammable materials to Joseph Shea, manager of the Apollo spacecraft program office. They then took this portrait and presented it to Shea shortly before the fatal accident with a caption that read, "It isn't that we don't trust you, Joe, but this time we've decided to go over your head." The story of war neurosis. Before shell shock was called war neurosis, or post-traumatic stress disorder, and before experts actually began to understand the psychological trauma that war could cause, veterans of World War I were largely left to fight their own mental health battles. The creepy historical image of the shell-shocked soldier seen here starkly highlights the horror of war, and what being stuck in a trench during the Battle of Flers-Courcelette could do to a man. Captured in September 1916, this photo was taken years before World War I even ended. By the time the end came, countless other men would suffer a similar fate. The cages on St Lamberts Church. Story of this church in Germany has 3 hanging cages that remain from the 1500s. 3 men were tortured and their remains left to rot in these cages. The cages once held the leaders of the Munster Rebellion. The story of Mark Jackson's basketball card. This basketball card is one of the most haunting card of all time. In the background are the Menendez brothers sitting courtside after they killed their parents. Joseph Lyle Menendez and Eric Galen Menendez are American brothers who were convicted in 1996 for the murders of their parents, Jose and Mary Menendez. The story of trophy heads. Long before Europe colonizers arrived in New Zealand, the native Maori people were preserving the severed heads of the fallen, known as makamoke. But when the British moved in during the 1840s, they soon pillaged the makamoke for themselves. Major General Horatio Gordon Robley, featured in this creepy old picture with his collection, who served in the British Army during the New Zealand Land Wars in the 1860s, was particularly fascinated by the Maori and stole at least 35 heads for himself. Story of mementomori photos. There was a tradition in Victorian England to take photos of dead people, often dressed in their best clothes and posed as if taking a family portrait. It's really unsettling looking at these. Sometimes the whole photo looks completely normal except one person looks a bit off, and you only realize when you look closer. It's also interesting because it shows how normal death was, back in an era where people weren't hospitalized for illness and so many children died in infancy. Death was a part of life, and most people had experienced death directly multiple times, so recording it was seen as recording normality as part of the grieving process. The story of the mummies of Venice. In 1647, laborers working on a cathedral in Venice, Italy found the eerily preserved remains of a man inside a tomb in the churchyard. His body had dried and shriveled to just 33 pounds, leaving his skin like parchment, but he hadn't decomposed. After more corpses like this one were found in the ensuing decades and centuries, locals and experts alike were long baffled as to how these bodies had been naturally mummified. Since the early 20th century, many have believed that a certain fungus was responsible, while more modern theories say that the particular soil and water conditions are the explanation. However, the mummies of Venice remain largely mysterious to this day. Story of the Russian ambassador Andrei Karlov. Andrei Gennadievich Karlov was a Russian diplomat, who served as the Russian ambassador to Turkey and earlier as the nation's ambassador to North Korea. This picture of Russian ambassador to Turkey Andrei Karlov standing in an art gallery about to do a conference. Behind him is Mevlut Merdal-Tintas, the man who is about to assassinate him.
The story of Anne Frank. This photo is of the well-known German Jewish diarist, Anne Frank, who was one of the victims of the Holocaust. She gained fame posthumously with the 1947 publication of The Diary of a Young Girl by her father, in which she documents her life in hiding from 1942 to 1944. It is one of the world's best-known books and has been the basis for several plays and films. This photograph was clicked a few months after Anne and their family went into hiding in October 1942.
Story of letter from Emmy Hawk. A letter from schizophrenic patient Emmy Hawk to her husband. It consists only phrase hers and Shatsy come, darling please come, and come, repeated over and over.
The man who didn't salute. Looking at the photo, we can see a man named August Landmesser, who during the Nazi rule in 1936, didn't raise his arm for Adolf Hitler. But what happened next will horrify you. August joined the party in 1931, but 2 years after he fell in love with Irma Eckler, a Jewish woman, who he proposed to her in 1935. For that reason, he was expelled from the army, and their marriage application was rejected. So, in 1936, he didn't lift his arm for Hitler, as shown in the photo. Ultimately, in 1938, August saw his family for the last time. Irma was transferred after giving her second child to the concentration camp, where she was killed. August was reported missing in 1944 during the military operation. Their daughters survived the Nazi persecution and later documented the story.
The story of the trapped girl. Amira Sanchez Garzon was a 13-year-old Colombian girl who got killed in the 1985 eruption of the Nevado del Ruiz volcano. The volcanic eruption killed nearly 25,000 people and destroyed over 13 villages. As soon as the lahar demolished the house of Sanchez, she got trapped beneath the debris of her house. She struggled for 3 days until she died there trapped in water. This photograph was taken by Frank Fournier just moments before her death. It was later designated as the World Press Photo of the Year for 1986. The story of the Diat Love Pass incident. In February 1959, 9 young Soviet hikers mysteriously died while trekking through the Ural Mountains in what's become known as the Diat Love Pass incident. While their bodies were found mangled in various gruesome ways, including missing tongues and eyes, no cause of death has ever been determined, with theories ranging from secret government experiments to aliens to the Yeti. This creepy photo shows the determined group traversing the harsh terrain just before they met their fate on the night of February 1st. Even though the Russian government reopened the case in 2019, it remains unsolved. The story of Joachim Kroll. German serial killer Joachim Kroll began acting on his macabre urges in 1955 and didn't stop for 2 decades. The Ruhr cannibal took at least 14 lives, with victims as young as 4 and as old as 61. His preferred method was to strangle them to death, engage in necrophilia, and then slice off parts of their flesh to eat. Kroll was finally caught in 1976 after police discovered that the intestines from one of his victims had clogged the plumbing in his apartment building. Taken soon after his capture, this photo shows Kroll reenacting one of his murders for the police. The story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The photos shown are of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as the atom bombs leveled everything to the ground. The picture shown right now is of Hiroshima, bombed on August 6, 1945. And this picture is of the Nagasaki bombing on August 9, 1945. The bombs killed nearly 160,000 people in Hiroshima and another 75,000 in Nagasaki. These whole nuclear bombings led to the end of World War II for Japan. The story of Ragu Rais photo. This horrific photo of a buried child is taken by Ragu Rais after the Bhopal gas tragedy. The Bhopal gas tragedy One of the world's worst disasters took place in 1984, claiming around 15,000 lives and injuring around 558,125 people. Acclaimed photojournalist Pablo Bartholomew and renowned photographer Ragu Rais went there to document the catastrophe. They came across a man who was burying his child. Bartholomew took a colored version of this photograph. Story of the Hartley violin. This is the Hartley violin, owned by Wallace Hartley, the bandmaster and lead violinist on the Titanic. It was the one he carried with him and played on the night the ship sank. Survivors reported seeing Hartley and his band on the deck of the ship during the sinking, playing to calm passengers as they boarded the insufficient lifeboats. Hartley and every member of the band died in the sinking. We have his violin because at some unknown point before his death, Hartley tucked the violin back into its monogram case for safekeeping. That's how it was found, floating in the debris field, by one of the ships sent to recover bodies from the wreck. They were able to identify it as Hartley's because of an engraved breastplate, and it was returned to his fiancée, who kept it until her death. Her family authenticated it and sold it for $1.6 million to an organization that collects Titanic artifacts. The story of Regina K Walters. Truck stop killer Robert Ben Rhodes may have killed more than 50 women while driving commercial trucks back and forth across America throughout the 1970s and 80s. But perhaps his most chilling murder is the one believed to be his last. Just before Rhodes murdered 14-year-old Regina K Walters in an Illinois barn in early 1990, he took a series of photos of her cowering in fear as he moved in for the kill. Authorities found this photo, and a collection of others like it, inside Rhodes' home after he was finally caught several months later. The story of the Jonestown Massacre. Until the September 11th attacks, the Jonestown Massacre was the single greatest deliberate loss of American civilian life in history. People's Temple cult leader Jim Jones convinced his followers that the government was coming to kill them and take their children, and that swallowing a fatal dose of cyanide was the only answer. So, on November 18, 1978, 918 people died at the cult's Jonestown settlement in Guyana after drinking a poison-laced fruit drink. This creepy picture shows Jones Center and a number of his followers pleasantly enjoying life at Jonestown not long before the massacre.